I'm delighted to be able to join you this evening. I'm just going to enter a few caveats, which are these. I'm not on the policy forum. I'm not on any of the commissions. So what I'm going to say about policy this evening is partly to reinforce all of the really brilliant policies that we had in 2019, and also to talk about how I think we can develop them and move them from where they were in, as you say, Claudia, in a socialist direction. Well, of course, there were very many very good proposals in 2019. And if we begin with early years, I think in a few short paragraphs, the manifesto encompassed everything that needed to be said about early years, with the single exception of the necessity to talk about the curriculum, but I will come on to that later. My own view of where policy needs to be is that we've got a national health service, we've absolutely got to have a national education service, and we need a national care service. And I think that, in a way, is a different way of talking about cradle to grave. It's born in the NHS, teaching and learning in the national education service, and then cared for, both in difficult times and also in old age with dignity through the national care service. So we can see how a Labour government with those policies could really genuinely be all things to all people in a very good way. But if I just start by saying that I think the early years aspect of the manifesto was, as I say, reasonably well worked out. But I'm going to focus my remarks, I think, on the school bit. And let me say, first of all, about the very good policies that were in there. Those of you who can remember as long ago as when Tony Blair was leader, he had this ridiculous notion of standards, not structures. And that government, led by Tony Blair, went on to create more structures and different types of schools in the education system than we had ever had before. And of course, we knew that there were going to be problems with those policies when it was that the Tories were saying, oh yes, this is policy with which we can work. So it was excellent that in the 2019 manifesto, there was talk of all schools enjoying common employment arrangements and national pay arrangements for teachers and for other workers in education. And of course, elsewhere, Laura Pidcock, who was then, of course, an MP, was leading the work on collective bargaining, so that we would have been back in the position where teachers actually knew where they were, rather than this system of having so many different types of schools. And of course, all schools under the way we would be looking at it would be following essentially the same rules, and it says that in the manifesto, and all would be part of the local accountability arrangements through reinvigorated local authorities, the democratic structure in which all can participate. Now, that affords so many really interesting things for teachers, for people who are teachers and who are other types of education workers. It means that teachers can actually engage in peer activities across schools. One of the things that's crept into education, it's in higher education, but it's also creeping into school education, is this notion of intellectual property rights. You know, there are academy trusts where if you write a worksheet on the academy trust time, i.e. during your working time, somehow or other they assume that they have the intellectual property rights to that. And this is because education has gone in entirely the wrong direction of not thinking about, you know, everybody wanting to work together for the good of all of the children working there, but working together across schools in the way that we did, again, as it says in the manifesto, through the very, very successful London Challenge. All of these existing policies could really mean that teachers are much better, they're in a much better employment situation, but also they're able to work together in a much more collaborative fashion. Now, one of the things that the manifesto was a little bit light on was the kind of next area that I particularly want to just give some attention to, which is the curriculum and assessment. And I must say, that is a particular area and interest of mine. for a long time now, when I talk about the curriculum in particular, I have been borrowing from it was something that was done by progressive teachers in the United States, although they meant something different by it. But the expression is that the curriculum should be a mirror and a window. So when you look at the curriculum, when anyone looks at the curriculum, because it's a mirror, they should be able to see themselves in the curriculum. They see that what they're learning about has a resonance for them and their own lives. But it's also a window through which they can look and see very many other different kinds of things. Now, it seems to me that what we need in order to be able to develop a curriculum that actually is like that, that does reflect that, is that we need something which I'm calling a National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. I'm going to come on to assessment, but curriculum and assessment obviously go together. And it seems to me a national council would be something that would not be a government department. It would be comprised of teachers through their unions, but also parents and carers, people who choose to be governors through local authorities, possibly academics, very importantly, community leaders of various kinds, and students themselves. It's absolutely critical that there is a student voice in the development of curriculum. And of course, you know, it may be felt that we should also have the voice of business at some stage, not with a dominant voice, but with a voice that says, you know, there are things, particularly later on and higher up the education system in FE when we're looking at skills development, where the voice of business should at least have a place. So a National Council for Curriculum and Assessment would be responsible for curriculum design and curriculum content. And so obviously at the moment there's a huge amount of discussion about Black Lives Matter and about how we cannot simply just, you know, when we get back to schools eventually in September or whenever it is, we cannot just assume that the curriculum will be exactly as it has been hitherto. I mean, one of the things that colleagues who've heard me speak before will know that I've said on a number of occasions is, you know, Black History Month, fabulous. Lots of people do fabulous stuff in Black History Month. But what about the other 11 months? And what about all of the other aspects of Black lives that are completely absent from the curriculum? So if we had a national council for the curriculum, we could actually hear those voices in curriculum design. And I think that is, frankly, absolutely critical. Now, it's true that the manifesto in 2019 did talk about an arts premium for arts education. It talked about Black history. It talked about learning about the Holocaust. It talked about the science of climate and the environment and those emergencies and how we deal with them. These are all really good ideas, but they mustn't be individual bits. We have to look at the curriculum holistically. And I think that it's absolutely essential that looking further forward, we actually gather all those ideas about what the curriculum might be like. And if it is going to be a mirror and a window, we definitely need as many perspectives as we can get. Now, if we move just briefly to the question of assessment, I think it's intriguing that Nick Gibbs, the schools minister, stood up, I think in the House of Commons, but he may have said it somewhere else, and said, doesn't really matter that Key Stage 2 SATs aren't happening this year, because actually they're about testing schools. I mean, you know, we've all known that for a very, very long time. But he said it in a way to try and assuage the anger of parents who thought it was a terrible thing that their kids would miss Key Stage 2 SATs. Now, we know that Jeremy came to the NEU conference and said that Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 SATs would go. And with Nick Gibbs saying they're just really about testing schools, I think here is a really, a really clear reason why we should not have that. Because we all know, those of us who are teachers and probably plenty of people who are parents know, that if you have this very rigid system of testing children, then you get the backwash effect, which is that most of the teaching is about the things that are going to be tested. They're not about the generality of life and the things that are important. And then we look at we look at the exams that we have at 16 plus. Now, again, those are not happening this year. And there are issues about why we would have a blanket, more or less blanket exam for children at 16 plus, young people at 16 plus, when actually we don't expect them to be leaving school, because we expect them to be staying in school. So why not rethink that whole question of assessment at 16 plus? Do we need it at all? If we do, why do we spend so much money on having it as an external examination system? Why not think about something which might be based more on teacher assessment? Although at this point, I enter the caveat that many teachers have been utterly de-skilled in the kind of interesting assessment that we think is important. And of course, it's absolutely true that there will be teachers with unconscious bias. Most of us have unconscious bias. And so if we're going to have more teacher assessment, then it has to be that we work on making sure that teachers are training themselves into how to do that, and that students engage with that kind of assessment themselves. And then when we get to A-level, well, actually, we probably do need some kind of exam at 18, although not all kids are doing A-level by any means. But actually the revision of what is done at the end of formal schooling, there was a perfectly good report from Tomlinson years ago when we still had the Blair government, looking at how we could assess children or young people right at the end of their school career. And I commend it to you. People can still find it, and it would need updating, but it's a really interesting thing to be looking at. Now, one of the other things that I think is absolutely critical for kids at all ages is partly that they need a curriculum, certainly in the early years and in primary, not based entirely on, but which has a very big input of play, because we all know the importance of play. I can tell you, I was once going to make a speech at the NUT conference, and I Googled adult play. I won't tell you what I got for that, but if we look at the kind of play that we have in the early years and look at the way that really helps with child development, we need to be looking at that into the primary years. And then once we look into the secondary years, I think it's really important that we are having a read across from whatever our department for culture, media and sport might be, to look at how we can make sure that kids really have a genuine access to sporting activities at all levels and in all different kinds of types of sport. And of course, critical, there has to be a big input of, what is broadly called culture into schools. There should, for example, be an entitlement that every child at least once a year is taken to some kind of cultural event. It may be the theatre, it may be a concert hall, it may be something, and I'm talking about local here. I'm not talking about children being brought down from West Yorkshire to go to the West End in London. I'm talking about engaging with all of the cultural settings that there are locally. I think it's absolutely vital that we have all that available to children, and it's seen as an entitlement. Now, what that means is that we really have to think about how much time we spend on the things that we do at the moment. I'm going to say two final things. I think that's probably my time up, Claudia, but you can indicate whether it is or not. One is that the whole kind of post-16, or actually in Tomlinson it was post-14 area of education, has not necessarily been well funded. So skills development is not something that we've, it's been deliberately underfunded over the last certainly decade by successive governments. And it is really important that we keep different pathways open for different types of young people. And also that there's not a pathway that ever ends in a dead end. One of the things that the Finnish system in Finland, the system in Finland prides itself on, is that wherever young people take themselves, they will never end up at a dead end. It's always possible to move across into a different setting if they change their minds and decide that something, they've taken perhaps a slightly wrong turn and they want to do something different. So I'm not going to say much about higher education, although I have to say that I think that a national council for the curriculum in higher and further education is also an important matter, and how that would be assessed. All the critical points about higher education were, of course, made in the previous manifesto of abolition of fees and so on, and it will be really interesting post-coronavirus to see how our institutions of higher education are going to manage. But again, I think we do seriously have to look at what it is that's being taught, and what the range of realistic options is for our young people in universities and in other places of learning, and indeed how they can learn in workplaces, because clearly the apprenticeship levy has not resulted in people having, much better quality of apprenticeships. But those are an important part of, for me, they're an important part of the National Education Service. So I think I may be coming close to the end of my time. I would say that the significant issue that was missing from the manifesto was this issue about who and how the curriculum and assessment works. And I would like to see that feature very largely in how we talk about education going forward. Thank you very much, Claudia.